Chapter 7 of Life in the Sickroom. Essays by an Invalid. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susie. Life in the Sickroom. Essays by an Invalid by Harriet Martineau. Becoming inured. Sunt homines qui cum patientia moriuntur, sunt autem quidem perfecti qui cum patientia vivunt. Saint Augustine. No cruel god of diligent cares that keep crowned woes awake, as things too wise for sleep, but reverent discipline, religious fear, and soft obedience find sweet biding here. The self-remembering soul sweetly recovers her kindred with the stars, not basely hovers below, but mediates the immortal way home to the source of light and intellectual day. Crawshaw. We hear every day benevolent and compassionate persons, in discussing the woes of sufferers, dwelling on the thought of such sufferers becoming inured, and we see them, if possible, reposing on this as the closing and conclusive idea. How natural this is! How often and how undoubtingly we did it ourselves in our days of ease! But how differently it sounds now! How quickly do we detect in it the discharge and dismissal of uneasy sympathies! How infallibly do we see how far it may be true, and what a tale could we tell of what is included in the phrase becoming inured, where it may be most truly applied, of what experience is involved in the process, where it is shortest and easiest. I was lately speaking to a tender-hearted woman who had known suffering, but not torment, of more than one case of persons who, dying slowly under a torturing disease, simply and naturally declared, shortly before death, the season of their illness to have been the happiest part of their lives. There are different ways of explaining this fact, which, though I always believed it, I did not till lately understand. My friend, however, found no difficulty. She said in a tone of pitying tenderness, but of perfect decision, "Oh, they become inured to it." I replied by some slight description of the suffering in the case which had impressed me most, and asked if she thought use and experience could soften pain like that. "Oh, yes," she again said, "they become inured to it. That is certainly the thing." Is it so? I am persuaded it is not. To the great majority of evils men may become inured, but not to all. To almost every kind, and to vast degrees of privation, moral and physical, they may become inured, and to chronic sufferings of mind and body. But I am convinced that there is no more possibility of becoming inured to acute agony of body than to paroxysms of remorse, the severest of moral pains. For the sake of both sufferers and sympathizers, it would be well that this should be thoroughly understood, that aid may not fall short, nor relief be looked for in the wrong direction. The truth is, as all will declare who are subject to a frequently recurring pain, a familiar pain becomes more and more dreaded instead of becoming lightly esteemed in proportion to its familiarity. The general sense of alarm which it probably occasioned when new may have given way and disappeared before a knowledge of consequences and a regular method of management or endurance. But the pain itself becomes more odious, more oppressive, more feared in proportion to the accumulation of experience of weary hours, in proportion to the aggregate of painful associations which every visitation revives. When it is moreover considered that the suffering part of the body is, if not recovering, growing continually more diseased and susceptible of pain, it will appear how little truth there is in the supposition of tortured persons becoming inured to torture. The inuring process, which I hold to be impossible in the cases mentioned, is, however, practicable and frequent in almost all cases of inferior suffering. But while all join in thanking God for this, there is a wide difference in the view taken of the fact by those who feel and those who only observe it. To the last, it is a clear and satisfactory truth, shining on the rock of futurity, which they can sit and gaze at from the window of their ease, commenting on the blessing of such a beacon light to those who need it. To those who need it, meanwhile, it is far, far off, sometimes hidden and sometimes despaired of, as the waves and the billows go over them, and the point can be reached only through sinkings and struggles and fears and anguish, with scanty breathing times between. Why is this not admitted in the case of the invalid as it is in that of the person losing a sense? One who is becoming blind or deaf is sure to grow inured in time. But through what a series of keen mortifications, of bitter privations! Everyone sees and understands this, while in the case of the invalid, many spring to the conclusion, overlooking the process of discipline which has, in that case, as in the other, to be undergone. It should never be forgotten how different a thing it is to read off this lesson from the clear print of assertion or observation, and to learn it experimentally and at a scarcely perceptible rate, line upon line and precept upon precept, when every line is burnt in by pain, and the long series of precepts are registered by their degrees of anguish. When the nature of the process has been sufficiently dwelt upon to be understood, that the hearts of the happy may be duly softened, and those of the suffering duly cheered by sympathy, then let all good be said of the inuring process, at least all the good that is true, and that is much. No wise man will declare that it is the best and healthiest condition for anyone. No wise man will deny that the healthiest moral condition is found where there is the most abundant happiness. Happiness is clearly the native heavenly atmosphere of the soul, that in which it is to live and move and have its being hereafter, and in proportion to its share of which, now and here, it makes its heavenly growth. The divinest souls, the loftiest, most disinterested and devoted, all unite in one testimony, that they have been best when happiest, that they were then most energetic and spontaneously devoted, least self-conscious. This must and may joyfully be granted, but as the mystery of evil is all round about us, as we have no choice whether or not to suffer, we may be freely thankful next for the inuring process, as being the possible means, though inferior to happiness, of divine ends. Far indeed does the sufferer feel from reaching those ends, when he contrasts his own state with that of the truly happy man. When he looks upon one so little lower than the angels, on his frame, so nerved and graced by health, his eye emitting the glow of the soul, his voice uttering the music of the heart, his hand strong to effect his purposes, his head erect in a liberty of ease, his intellect and soul free from perplexities and cares, and not only at leisure for the service of others, but restless to impart to them of his own overflowing good. When the sufferer contemplates such a being and contrasts him with himself, he may well feel how much he has to do to approach this higher order of his race, aware of his own internal tremblings at the touch of the familiar pain, sinking in weakness before the bare idea of enterprise, abashed by self-consciousness, smarting under tenderness of conscience, perplexed and bewildered by the intricacy and vastness of human woe, of which his own suffering gives him too keen a sense. Well may he who is in the bonds of pain look humbly to him who walks gloriously in joy, and the humility might sink into abjectness if the matter ended here, if the inuring process were not at work. But herein is ample ground for hope now, and greatness in the future, and of a secondary, still a sufficient greatness. The sufferer may well be satisfied, and needs be abashed before no mortal, if he obtains, sooner or later, the power to achieve divine ends through the experience of his lot. If, beginning by encountering his familiar pain, and putting down the dread of it by looking merely to the comfort of the reaction when it ceases, he attains at length to conquering pain by the power of ideas. If ease of body being out of the question, he makes activity of spirit suffice him. If his own future in this life being a blank, he becomes absorbed in that of other men. If, imprisoned by disease, kingdoms and races are not wide enough for his sympathies, if, as this or that sense is extinguished, or this or that limb is laid fast, his spirit becomes more alive in every faculty. If familiarity with his pain enables him so to deal with it, as resolutely to cut off every morbid spiritual growth to which he has been made liable by pain, if, instead of succumbing to unfavourable conditions, he has struggled against dwarfage and distortion, and diligently wrought at the renewal of the inward man, while the outward frame was decaying day by day, he may surmount his humiliations, whatever cause for humility may be left by so impaired an existence. For him the inuring process will have done its best. For those who from constitutional irritability cannot become inured, there is daily opening, and at a shorter distance, the grave, where the weary are at rest. For those on whom the inuring process acts amiss, petrifying instead of vivifying the soul, we may and must hope, on the ground that they are in the hands of one whose ways and thoughts are not ours, nor within our ken. They are a mystery to us, like the cankered buds and blighted blossoms of our gardens. Or it may be that there is no corruption or decay, but only torpidity, induced by the protraction of the polar night of adversity. It may be that their life is only hidden away for a season, and that when the breath of eternal spring shall dissolve their icy bonds, they may start forth as newborn, and their preceding deadness be mercifully counted to them but as a long dream. There is no danger, no false security to oneself in hoping thus much for them, for one must be as far from reconciling oneself to their condition as from preferring dreams to contemplation, or the sleep of the frame to the life of the spirit. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Life in the Sickroom. Essays by an Invalid. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life in the Sickroom. Essays by an Invalid by Harriet Martineau. Chapter 8. Power of Ideas in the Sickroom. Turn you to the stronghold, ye prisoners of hope. Zechariah. Wherefore for virtue's sake I can be well content, the sweetest time in all my life to deem in thinking spent. Lord Vaux. It is amusing, in a somewhat mournful way, however, to sick people, to observe how children and other inexperienced persons believe, notwithstanding all explanation and assurance, that it must be a very pleasant thing to be ill, gently ill, so as not to be groaning with pain, or confined to bed. They derive an impression of comfort and luxury from what they see, which it is impossible to weaken by descriptions of suffering which they have never felt and cannot conceive of. They see the warm room in winter with its well-cushioned couch, and think how comfortable it must be never to have the toes frozen or a shower of sleet driven in one's face. The fire in the chamber all night, the flowers and books that lie strewed about all day, the pictures on the walls, the dainty meals, the punctual and careful attendance, these are things which make illness look extremely pleasant to the healthiest people, who are those that have the keenest relish for pleasure. Few of such are there who have that insight of sympathy which drew from my little friend at my elbow the sighing exclamation, "Ah, but there is the unhealthiness that spoils everything." Even if the ordinary run of inexperienced persons could see the whole of our day, I should not expect them to understand the matter much better. If they saw us turn from the dainty meal and wear a look of distress and fear, in the midst of everything that to them indicates comfort and security, I imagine they could only wonder till they knew for themselves how bodily distress excludes pleasure from outward objects, and how the mental weakness which prevail amidst an unnatural and difficult mode of life convert the most innocent and ordinary occurrences into occasions of apprehension or of self-distrust or self-disgust. If they must witness the painful and humbling aspect of the mode of life, it is much to be wished that they might also see another fact belonging to it. To them, perhaps no less mysterious than the misery, but not the less salutary for that, as it may teach them that there is much, both of good and evil, in our condition, which it will be wiser in them to observe than to judge of. The benign mystery which I would have them witness is the power of ideas over us. A child knows something of this in his own way. In wartime, little boys leave their pet plays to run about and tell everybody the news of a great battle. A child cannot eat the best dinner in the world on the day of first going to the play. The doll is thrown into a corner when news comes of any acquaintance being burnt out in the middle of the night, or when anecdotes are telling of any old martyr who suffered heroically. In their own way, children are conscious when reminded of the power of ideas, but they cannot conceive of our way of experiencing the same force, to us so renovating. If it is at times surprising to the most enlightened and sympathizing of our companions, it may well be astonishing to those in the early stages of observation. They see with a sort of awe how priceless are certain pictures to us in comparison with all others. They hear us speak of the landscapes, the portraits, the graceful and beautiful images which adorn the walls, but they observe how, when restless and distressed, we steal a glance upwards at one picture and find something there which seems to set us right, to rally us at once. If such a picture as the Christus Consolator of Schaeffer be within view of the sick couch, that talisman, including the consolations of 18 centuries, that mysterious assemblage of the redeemed captives and tranquilized mourners of a whole Christendom, that inspired epitome of suffering and solace, it may well be a cause of wonder, almost amounting to alarm, to those who, not having needed, have never felt its power. If there were now burnings or drownings for sorcery, that picture, and some who possess it, would soon be in the fire or at the bottom of a pond. No mute operation of witchcraft, or its dread, could exceed the silent power of that picture over sufferers. Again, if the inexperienced chance to see us in an unfavorable hour, when our self-control cannot rise beyond constraint, when our words are fewest, however gentle the voice, when our posture is rigid because we will not be restless, and our faces tell the distress we think we are concealing, if at such a time the post comes in, how miraculous must seem the change to one who does not know what we have just read in letters or newspapers, and perhaps could not understand its efficacy if he had seen. He sees us start up on the couch, hears us become voluble and talk in a free and joyous tone, beholds us eat and drink without thinking what is put before us, perhaps is surprised at a flow of tears which seems to dissolve the misery, whatever it was, and finds to his amazement that all this is caused by something to him so dry as the appointment of a committee in the House, a speech on some hustings, an improved quarter's revenue, or perhaps something not dry, but merely curious, and to him anything but moving, a new appearance attending an eclipse, an arrangement for embanking the Nile, or cutting through the Isthmus of Panama, or some vast discovery in science or the arts. He may again see the relaxation yet more complete, may perceive without a word being spoken that we are well for the hour, the eye swimming in happiness, the voice full of gentle joy, so that he is convinced that illness does not spoil everything. In this case some comfort has come, too sacred to be told, at least then, some news or appeal from the primary Christians and confessors of our day, the American abolitionists, some opening to us for doing some little service, or, as not seldom happens, some word of true sympathy which rouses our spirit as the trumpet stirs the war horse, some sudden light showing our position on our pilgrim path, some hint of our high calling, some apt warming of a pregnant truth, administered by a wise and loving comforter. If I were asked whether there is any one idea more potential than any other over every sort of suffering in a mode of life like ours, most hearers of the question would make haste to answer for me that there is such a variety of potential ideas suited to such wide differences of mood, of mind and body, that it must be impossible to measure the strength of any one. Nevertheless, I should reply that there is one to me more powerful at present than I can now conceive any single idea to have been in any former states of my mind. It is this, that it matters infinitely less what we do than what we are. I can conceive the amazement of many at this announcement, of many even who admit its truth, and feelingly admit it, as I myself did when it was first brought home to me from the printed page of one friend by the heart-breathing voice of another. I care not who wonders, and who only half understands, while there are some few to whom this thought may be what it is to me. No one will be so short-sighted as to apply it as an excuse for indolence in the active and healthy. So clear is it that such cannot be what they ought to be unless they do all they can. But perhaps it is only the practised in human sorrows who can see far enough into the boundless truth of this thought to appreciate its worth to us. Suffice it here that it has the power I ascribe to it, and that we, whom it has consoled, long to administer it when we see old age restless in its infirmity, actively disappointed of its scope or instruments, or the most useful agents of society, the most indispensable members of families paralyzed by disease. We long to whisper it in the dungeons of Spielberg, where it opens a career within the narrowest recess of those thick walls. We long to send a missive to every couch of the sick, to every armchair of the aged and the blind, reminding them that the great work of life is ours still, through all modes of life, but that of the madhouse, the formation of a heavenly soul within us. If we cannot pursue a trade, or a science, or keep house, or help the state, or write books, or earn our own bread or that of others, we can do the work to which all of this is only subsidiary. We can cherish a sweet and holy temper. We can vindicate the supremacy of mind over body. We can, in defiance of our liabilities, minister pleasure and hope to the gayest who come prepared to receive pain from the spectacle of our pain. We can, here as well as in heaven's courts hereafter, reveal the angel growing into its immortal aspect, which is the highest achievement we could propose to ourselves, or that grace from above could propose to us, if we had a free choice of all possible conditions of human life. If any doubt the worth of the thought, from the common habit of overlooking the importance of what is done in its character of index of what the agent is, let him resort at once to the fountainhead of spiritual exemplification, and say whether it matters most what Christ was or what he did. The worth of this particular thought is a separate consideration from that of the worth of any sound abstract idea to sufferers liable to a besetting personal recollection, or doubt, or care. But before I speak of this, I must allude to a subject which causes inexpressible pain whenever it occurs to us sick prisoners. I have said how unavailing is luxury when the body is distressed and the spirit faint. At such times, and at all times, we cannot but be deeply grieved at the conception of the converse of our own state, at the thought of the multitude of poor suffering under privation, without the support and solace of great ideas. It is sad enough to think of them on a winter's night, aching with cold in every limb, and sunk as low as we in nerve and spirits, from their want of sufficient food. But this thought is supportable in cases where we may fairly hope that the greatest ideas are cheering them as we are cheered, that there is a mere set-off of their cold and hunger against our disease, and that we alike, inspired by spiritual vigor in the belief that our Father is with us, that we are only encountering the probations of our pilgrimage, that we have a divine work given us to carry out, now in pain and now in joy. There is comfort in the midst of the sadness and shame when we are thinking of the poor who can reflect and pray, of the old woman who was once a punctual and eager attendant at church, of the wasting child who was formerly a Sunday scholar, of the reduced gentleman or destitute student who retain the privilege of their humanity, of looking before and after. But there is no mitigation of the horror when we think of the savage poor, who form so large a proportion of the hungerers, when we conceive of them suffering the privation of all good things at once, suffering under the aching cold, the sinking hunger, the shivering nakedness, without the respite or solace afforded by one inspiring or beguiling idea. I will not dwell on the reflection. A glimpse into this hell ought to suffice, though we, to whom imagery comes unbidden and cannot be banished at will, have to bear much more than occasional glimpses. A glimpse ought to suffice to set all to work to procure for every one of these sufferers bread and warmth, if possible, and as soon as possible. But above everything, and without the loss of an hour, an entrance upon their spiritual birthright. Every man and every woman, however wise and tender appearing and designing to be, who for an hour helps to keep closed the entrance to the region of ideas, who stands between sufferers and great thoughts, which are the angels of consolation sent by God to all to whom he has given souls, are in so far ministers of hell, not themselves inflicting torment, but intercepting the influences which would assuage or overpower it. Let the plea be heard of us sufferers, who know well the power of ideas, our plea for the poor, that while we are contriving for all to be fed and cherished by food and fire, we may meanwhile kindle the immortal vitality within them, and give them that ethereal solace and sustenance which was meant to be shared by all, without money and without price. It seems but just, if we may venture so to speak, that there should be the renovating power in ideas that I have described, for our worst sufferings arise from an unmitigated power of ideas in another sort. I am not qualified by experience to speak of severe continued bodily torment, but all testimony seems to concur with all our experience that there is no such instrument of torture as a besetting thought. The mere description of the suffering given by those who know it seems to have wrought upon the general mind, for a kind of shudder goes round when it is mentioned, though it can no more be conceived of by the gay and occupied than the continual dropping of water on the head can be imagined by him whose transactions with the element consist in a plunge bath every morning. It is known, however, that Herculean men have shrunk to shadows under the infliction, that it has reduced heroes to tremble at the whispering wind or the striking of the clock, that it turns the raven-haired grey, lets down genius into idiocy, and starves the most vigorous life into an atrophy. How then are the sick to meet this woe, which comes upon them with force exactly proportioned to their weakness? If every sick prisoner in our land were questioned, and could and would answer truly, I believe all would reply, all who have minds, that their worst pangs are in their soul. For the moment, for the hour, no agony is, I know, to be compared with some pains of body. But when the question is of months and years, including the seasons of delicious reaction from bodily pains, I am confident that the peculiar misery of our condition, subjection to a besetting thought, will be owned to absorb all others, whether the thought relate to any intellectual matter, or whether it be self-abasement and self-weariness at the perpetually recurring apparition of sins, follies, trifling old misadventures and misbehavior, or whether some more serious cause of remorse. The tormenting and weakening effects are much alike. The cold horror at waking up to the thought in the middle of the night, knowing that we shall sleep no more. The misery of opening our eyes upon a new day with the spell of the thought full upon us. The dread of giving ourselves up to thinking, and yet the inability to read while the enemy is hovering about the page. The faint resolution, broken almost as surely as formed, not to speak of this trouble to our nearest and closest friend, and the ending in speaking of it in our agony to many besides. Oh, there is no aching, no shooting or throbbing pain of fibre or nerve that can, taken with its alternations, compare in misery with this. Even the anticipation becomes in time the worst, though the bodily pain is known to be real and unavoidable, while the ideal one is clearly seen to be baseless or enormously exaggerated. The close observer of a sick sufferer may see the drops stand on the forehead, and the quiver pass over the lip, at the bare thought of the certain return of a periodical pain. But worse to endure is the sickening of the soul at the certainty that at such an hour we shall be under the spiritual domination of a haunting demon, the foe, as foolish as cruel, whom we defy now with our reason, but then shall succumb to it in every faculty. Here is an ordeal for the proud, and yet it is not less fearful to the humble, for the humble can no more dispense with self-respect than the proud. Some may wonder at such a history of an unknown trouble, some who, when anything harass them, mount a horse and gallop over the sea sands or the race course, or visit their friends or the theatre, or resort to music or romp with children. Let them remember that we cannot do these things, that the very weakness which subjects us to these troubles forbids our escape from them. We know as well as they that if once we could feel the open air upon our brows, our feet on the grass, our bodies in exercise and vigor, all would be well with us. But as we cannot use these remedies, the knowledge is of no immediate avail. If we can get to the window and look abroad, that is well as far as it goes. But we are most subject to our tyrant in the night, and in midwinter, at times when we cannot look abroad, and it may even happen, too, that the tyrant dims the sun at noonday and blots out the landscape, or renders us blind to it. What then is to be done? We evade the misery when we can by stirring books, the most objective that can be had, or by seeing what we can see of the world by the telescope, or resorting to some sweet familiar spring of poetry. But this last expedient is impaired by the fear of mixing painful associations with pleasures too sacred and dear to be endangered. Or we defy the foe in reckless anguish, or we endure in silent patience. But there is something far better to be done, not always, but still not seldom. We can turn the forces of ideas against themselves, meet them with their own weapons. We can call in the power of an idea to overcome the tyranny of another idea, and then we come off conquerors with a soul-felt joy. It is a joy to recur in memory or imagination to any moral conflict, past or possible, in which all our faculties are needed, and wherein that force is at least conceived to be employed which must otherwise corrode us. But if any such enterprise actually presents itself, confronts us at the moment, how great is the blessing! It may bring toil and difficulty to ourselves, and doubt and blame from others, but if it be clear to ourselves, how keen is the sense of life it gives at some seasons! Though it may overpower our weakness at others, it seems hard when we are feeble and suffering to have irksome labor to do, to have to oppose the wishes and feelings of some whom we love, and to arouse argument when our longing is for unbroken and lasting rest. But if our duty be but clear to ourselves, or for the most part clear with doubts only in our most sickly hours, what a new position we find ourselves in, permitted once more to take the offensive side against evil, in alternation with a weary, perpetual defensive posture. Happy they who have been brought up in allegiance to duty more or less strict, and happiest they whose loyalty has been the strictest. In the hour of nature's feebleness and apparent decay, they find themselves under the eye and hand of the physician of souls, who has for them a cordial of heavenly virtue for them, but of no virtue to such as have let their moral nature take its chance, and who, in their hour of extreme need, are no more capable of spiritual enterprise than of a bodily flight beyond the precincts of their pain. They must languish in self-corrosion, while they who happily find how duty gives power to the faint mount up with wings as eagles. With every emergency of singular or unpopular moral action, every occasion for saying with courage a true word, or advocating a neglected cause, with every opportunity, in short, of spiritual enterprise, they soar afresh, and their eyes kindle anew in the light of life. But this kind of solace could not be, nor any effectual kind, but for the power of the master idea of our life, but for him who stirreth up the nest, and whose spirit taketh and beareth them up sunwards on her wings. The flights of these eagle spirits would utterly fail. But for the ideas inspired by faith, there could be no enterprise, no true solace, no endurance but of the low, merely submissive kind. Great is the power of all thought, congenial with our nature, over disease of the body and morbid tendencies of the mind. But those which connect us with the maker of our frame and the ordainer of our lot are absolutely omnipotent. Oh, let the speculative observer of human nature consider well, and observe that human nature to its extremest limits, before he pronounces that our spirits are not created filial. Let him ponder well the universal aspiration towards a spiritually discerned parent, before he declares the affection a mere venerable superstition. Let him feel in health and full action. Or if he feels it not, let him detect in others the pausing horror of a sense of orphanhood, beneath which the moral universe falls in pieces under the hands of its myriad builders. Let him see in the sick chamber, where the outward and inward world seemed alike to the sufferer to be crumbling asunder, how irresistible is the conviction of an upholding power, new modelling all decaying things, and imbuing them with immortality. If he himself can but learn what protracted sickness is, let him ponder well whether a superstition, however early and solemnly conveyed and cherished, could stand the stress not merely of pain, but of the questionings prompted by pain. Let him say if it can be anything but truth, absolute congeniality with our souls, which can give such all-conquering power to the idea of our filial relation to the ruler of all things. No one will venture to say how this power is enhanced by the earliest associations. No one will presume to declare precisely how happy above others are they, now sufferers, whose infant speech was practised in prayer at a mother's knee, and who can now forget the dreariness of the night and the weight of the day in listening for the echoes of old psalmody, and reviving snatches of youthful hymns and religious reverie. No one will dare to say how far the sweet call to the weary and heavy laden is endeared by the voice of the shepherd, having gone before us over all the hills and vales of our life. But the true philosopher must, as it seems to me, be assured that the power of these spiritual appeals would ooze away in proportion as our faculties are weakened by disease, if they had not in them the divine force of truth to urge them home. See what this force is in comparison with others that are tendered for our solace. One and another of our friends comes to us with an earnest pressing upon us of the hope of relief, that talisman which looks so well till its virtues are tried. They tell us of renewed health and activity, of what it will be to enjoy ease again, to be useful again, to shake off our troubles and be as we once were. We sigh and say it may be so, but they see that we are neither roused nor soothed by it. Then one speaks differently, tells us we shall never be better, that we shall continue for long years as we are, or shall sink into deeper disease and death, adding that pain and disturbance and death are indissolubly linked with the indestructible life of the soul. And supposing that we are willing to be conducted on this eternal course by Him whose thoughts and ways are not as ours, but whose tenderness, then how we burst in and take up the word. What have we not to say from the abundance of our hearts, of that benignity, that transcendent wisdom, our willingness, our eagerness, our sweet security, until we are silenced by our unutterable joy. Whence this imbecility of the hope of relief? Whence this power of the idea of God our Father? Do we know of anything stronger and higher than ideas? In the strongest and highest, even an omnipotent and infinite idea, if we have not truth, what is truth? End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Life in the Sickroom, Essays by an Invalid. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life in the Sickroom, Essays by an Invalid by Harriet Martineau. Chapter 9. Some Perils and Pains of Invalidism. But few that court retirement are aware of half the tolls they must encounter there. Quote by Cowper. We are not to repine, but we may lawfully struggle. Quote by Johnson. I desire to notice, very briefly, some perils and pains of our condition, briefly premising that, as only the initiated can fully sympathize, it will be sufficient, and therefore best, to indicate rather than expatiate. We are in ever-growing danger of becoming too abstract, of losing our sympathy with passing emotions, and particularly with those shared by numbers. There was a time when we went to public worship with others, to the theater, to public meetings, when we were present at picnic parties and other festivals, and heard general conversation every day of our lives. Now we are too apt to forget those times. The danger is, lest we should get to despise them, and to fancy ourselves superior to our former selves, because now we feel no social transports. A lesser danger is that of fearing to experience emotions. If a barrel organ makes itself heard from the street, or a salute on anniversaries from the castle, or a crowd gathers on the ridge to enjoy a regatta, what a strange thrill comes over us! What a shrinking from being moved! How we wonder when we recall some discourse, whereby the voice of the preacher roused the souls of a multitude at once, or when we awake within us the echoes of some Easter anthem, or of the Hallelujah chorus in Westminster Abbey, or when we image to ourselves a crowded theater, when one tragic fear or horror bound together all the spirits that came for pleasure, when we try to imagine a flow of talk in which minds uttered themselves without thought of individuals, when we revive these scenes of our former lives, we gasp for breath, we wonder what we could have been made of to endure the excitement. We are certain that we should die on the spot if we encountered it now. It might be so, but we must remember that our present condition is the morbid one, and not the former. We must keep up our sympathies as far as we may by cherishing such festal feelings as may survive, and ever remembering that our grave and solid and abstract life is adapted to only a portion of our nature, and that our exclusion from spontaneous emotions, from all experience of sympathetic transport, is a heavy misfortune, under which it behooves us to humble ourselves. Those of us are well off who have, like myself, the advantage of some outward symbol which serves as communication between them and the world. Flags are my resource of this kind. Little do those who hoist them imagine how a hidden invalid appropriates their signals. The Union Jack on the flagstaff in the castle yard marks Sunday to me in a way I would not miss. When I look abroad on Sabbath mornings, it tells of rest and church-going, and it is a matter of serious business with me to see it brought down at sunset, a mute token in which there is more pathos than I could tell. And then the flags on the churches of the opposite shore on festal days tell me of a stirring holiday world, make me hear again the park and tower guns, show me fireworks and illuminations, and arouse something of the hum and buzz of a gay and moving crowd. Once more the foreign flags hoisted by ships coming into port, mere signals for pilots in intention, speak, unknown to anyone, a world of things to me. I learned them long ago by heart and with my heart. When I see a foreign vessel come bounding towards the harbor and perceive, the moment she hoists her flag, whether she has cut across from a Norway fjord, or has contested her way from the Levant, or found a path from the far Indies, or brings greetings from some familiar American port, what a boon is that flag to me! Sometimes I point my telescope to see the sailor's lips move in the utterance of a foreign tongue. At all events, I see in a moment the peaks of Sulitelma or of the Andes, or the summits of the Ghauts, or tropical sands, or chilly pine forests spread before me, or palmy West Indian groves. It is morally good and unspeakably refreshing to have some such instrumentality of signals with the world without, as these flags are to me. There is a corresponding danger, though a less serious one, in such sympathy as we have making us repine. Though we may go on from month to month without one momentary wish that things were otherwise with us than as they are, yet, on occasion, once perhaps in a year, some incident wakens a thrill of longing to be as we once were. Some notice of a concert or a picture brings up the associations of a London spring, with all its intellectual and social pleasures. Or the mere mention of a lane or hedge at the moment the March sun is shining in recalls the first hunting for violets in our days of long walks. Or a foreign postmark in autumn transports us to Alpine passes or the shores of Italian lakes, and a sickly longing for scenes we shall see no more comes over us. But the reaction is so rapid and sure that there is little moral peril in this, only the evanescent pain which gives place to that act of acquiescence which has in it more joy than can be gathered from all the lanes, mountains, and shores of the globe. The occasional sense of our being too weak for the ordinary incidents of life is strangely distressing. The cry of an infant makes us wretched for hours after, in spite of every effort of reason. I saw, through my telescope, 2 big boys worrying a little one, and I could not look to see the end of it. They were so far off that there was nothing to be done. The distress to me was such, the picture of the lives of the 3 boys was so vivid, that I felt as if I had no reason nor courage left. The same sort of distress recurred, but in a more moderate degree, when I saw a gentleman do a thing which I wish could dwell on his mind as it does upon mine. I saw, through the same telescope, a gentleman pick up from the grass, where children had been playing the moment before, under the walls of the fort, a gay harlequin, one of those toy figures whose limbs jerk with a string. He carried it to his party, a lady and another gentleman, sitting on a bench at the top of the rocks, whose base the sea was washing. When he had shown off the jerkings of the toy sufficiently, he began to take aim with it, as if to see how far he could throw. He never will, thought I, throw that toy into the sea while there are stones lying all about within reach. He did it. Away whirled Harlequin through the air, far into the sea below, and there was no appearance of any remonstrance on the part of his companions. I could not look again towards the grass to see the misery of the little owner of the toy on finding it gone. There was no comfort in the air of genteel complacency with which the 3 gentry walked down from the rocks after this magnanimous deed. How glad should I be if this page should ever meet the eye of any one of them and strike a late remorse into them. To me, the incident brought back the passions of my childhood, the shock I have never got over to this hour on reading that too torturing story of Miss Edgeworth's about the footman who broke off all the bobbins and put them in his pocket, rolled the weaving pillow down the dirty lane, jumped up behind his lady's carriage, and was out of sight in an instant. I think these must be the words, for they burnt themselves in upon my childish brain and have stirred me with passion many a time since, as this harlequin adventure will ever do. Many will wonder at all this, will despise such sensitiveness to trifles, considering what deeds are done every day in the world. They do not know the pains and penalties of sickness, that is all. And it may do them no harm to learn what they are, while my fellow sufferers may find some comfort in an honest recognition of them. This sensitiveness takes worse directions, however, and inflicts more misery still. It subjects some of us to a scrupulosity, particularly about truth, which brings endless troubles. Every mistake of fact that we happen to know of afflicts us as if we were responsible for it, and more than it ought if we were so responsible. We tend to an absurd restlessness to set everything right, and of course, above all, what concerns ourselves. If any kind friend pities us too much, and praises us for our patience under sufferings which he supposes to be greater than we are actually enduring, we remonstrate and explain as if his sympathy were not good for him and us, at any rate, and as if, having told only truth ourselves, it could matter much how our troubles are rated, whether over or under. We call up images of all who suffer far more than ourselves, and implore him to go and pity them, to honor them and not us. If he smiles and answers, well, he will go and pity and honor them, but he must be sorry for us, too. We smile, also, at our own scrupulosity, though we see in it only a new symptom of disease. There is yet a worse direction taken by this sensitiveness, both morally and in experience worse. Though our observation of life encourages hope, on the whole, to a boundless extent, both as to affairs and to human character, it teaches some truths about individual characters which are almost too much for our weakened condition. It may be absurd, it may be wrong, to be more afflicted about the faults and failings of the best and most beloved people than about the vices and gross follies of a lower order of men. But such affliction is, to us, quite inevitable. It is not wholly irrational, for it is a melancholy sight to witness the encroachment of any bad habit of mind in those who should be outgrowing such bad habits, instead of being mastered by them. But we know it to be the common order of things that every man, even the best, carries about with him through life some fault or failing, the shadowy side of his brightest quality, if nothing worse, and that it is the rarest thing in the world to see any strong tendency overcome after the age of resolution. The youthful season of moral heroism is past. Yet, knowing this, it is not the less painful to witness it, with the clearness and strength with which the spectacle offers itself to us on our post of observation. While working in the world side by side with those whose doings we now contemplate, we were willing to be deceived in each particular instance, willing to expect that the judgment and action of those we loved and clung to would, in each case, be accordant with their best gifts and graces, and, however often disappointed, we made allowance for the known frailty and inconsistently hoped it would be better next time. We now see too clearly to be deceived. With the discernment of love and the power of leisure, we can accurately calculate the allowance to be made. We can precisely measure the obliquity beforehand, and save ourselves at least from disappointment. But there is no solace in this. There is more pain in the proof of the permanent character of faults, permanence including inevitable growth, than in perpetual new evidence of their existence. More sorrow in our prophetic power now than in our credulous weakness of old. The accurate readers of human character may be admired and envied for their infallible knowledge of how men will think and act, But if they have a true heart, love for those whom they watch, they cannot much enjoy their power. If they have not love, neither can they be happy, so that it requires a penetrative knowledge indeed, into the ways of God as well as man, for such skill to be reconcilable with peace and with our human affections. It is a burdensome knowledge for us to wield in our weakened condition, and one which it requires an ever-strengthening faith to convert into a nourisher of love. The faults I have alluded to are such only as are compatible with general sincerity, such as have a character of frailty. Those which include tendencies essentially low, untruth, double-dealing, and selfish policy, assume so disgusting an aspect, when tested by the trying light and amidst the solemn leisure of the sick-room, that it cannot be wrong to follow willingly the irresistible leadings of nature, to dismiss them with loathing, and invite to our arms the simple and heroic sincerity, and the cheerful devotedness to the honor of God and the interests of man, which here assume much of the radiance in which they come back in vision from beyond the grave. If it be true that our moral taste becomes more sensitive in our seclusion, I trust that such sensitiveness has not necessarily any fastidiousness in it, but that its relish of good grows in full proportion to its discipline. I trust that if its disgust deepens as the low and cowardly order of faults are stripped to nakedness, so does its appreciation become more expanded and generous in regard to qualities which befit our heroic and aspiring nature and destination. As for our best resource under the liabilities I have alluded to, a mere reference will suffice. Whatsoever things are honest, pure, holy, lovely, to think on these things, to fill our souls with conceptions of the godlike, so that our sensitiveness may turn in time to a keen apprehension of all that is in affinity with these. This is what we have to do, partly for present solace, and much more for the chance of converting our weakness into power, our mortal discipline into a heavenly habitude. As for the ordinary and familiar sufferings and dangers of our state, the weariness of life which everyone but the physician wonders at, often as it is witnessed, the longing for non-existence which some pious people, who admit no bodily origin of any mental affection, are very much shocked at, the despair during protracted violent pain, which, however, being dumb, is seldom known at the moment, these cannot be illustrated nor remedied by anything that can be said on paper. One can only suggest to the sufferer and to wise nurses that in the power of ideas we are furnished with an implement of natural magic which may possibly operate at the most hopeless times. It was in a sort of despair that the father of the lame child, inconsiderately let out too far, gave the boy his stick to ride home on, whereupon the aching foot actually traversed the needful mile without being felt to ache. So the wise nurse may possibly find that a nobler idea than any hope of rest or relief may reanimate a spirit under a far severer pain. And assuredly there are some who could tell how, in the midst of anguish, the briefest suggestion of endurance, the slightest spiritual touch upon deep filial affections, has made a miraculous truce for them with torment and despair. Observers of the sick think very seriously of their liability to become wedded to their own ways, and engrossed by their own occupations. The fact is, as they see it, but it would be happy for us if we had no worse mistakes to apprehend. Those of the sequestered who may re-enter the world will be pretty sure to fall in love with new ways and employments, and to feel a quite sufficient disgust with their own. And if they are never to re-enter life, is it not well for them that they can spend some energies which would otherwise be corrosive upon outward things? If their souls are too narrow and purblind to live beyond the bounds of their abode, the best thing for them is to get through the rest of their time as easily as they can in the way that suits them best. If they are of a higher order, their observers may be assured of two things: that their investment of energy on the ways and occupations of their singular and trying life is no more than a needful absorption of a power which would otherwise destroy them, and also that there is no fear of these things becoming indispensable to them or sufficient for them. There are hours, witnessed by no observers, when they find it wise to desist from their most esteemed employments, in condescension to their own weakness, and recognize in this discipline the lesson of the day. There are hours, witnessed by no observers, when the insufficiency of such objects is felt as keenly and pressingly as by the missionary on his way to the heathen, or the prime minister with the interests of nations in the balance before his eyes, or by the drowning man before whose soul life lies pictured in the instant of time which remains to him. This liability, though real, is insignificant and transient compared with many others. There is a safeguard against it, too, in our own weakness. There is even, for some, a danger of growing absolutely idle from a sense of the littleness of what they can do. Formerly they acted on the rule, not a day without a line, and now, thrown out of their habit by the absolute incapacity of some days, and disheartened by the small show made by their utmost rational diligence, they give up and do nothing, or nothing with regularity. This is a fearful danger. Nowhere are habits of regular employment more necessary than in such a life as ours. And if we cannot preserve the absolute erectness of rationality, if we must lean to the error of particularity or of indifference, I have no doubt of the former being the safer of the two, the least injurious and the most curable under a change of influences. One of our most humbling and trying liabilities I do not remember to have seen mentioned anywhere, though it is so common and so deeply felt that I have no doubt of a response from every sick prisoner of a considerate mind, whose eye will fall upon this page. I mean our unfitness for doubtful moral enterprise. For doubtful moral enterprise, let it be observed. Where the case is clear, where the right appears to our own eyes to be all on one side, whatever may be on the other, moral enterprise becomes our best medicine. It becomes health and new life to us, as I have elsewhere said, be the responsibility and the immediate consequences to ourselves what they may. But when the case is not so clear, when we are pressed, as all conscientious people, sick or well, strong or feeble, are at times, by antagonist considerations of duty, we cannot, as in our vigorous days, take a part in some clear hour and strengthen ourselves to bear recurring doubts, and to take cheerfully even conviction of mistake, if experience should prove our conscientious decision to have been unsound. We are not in a condition to bear recurring doubts or to take cheerfully a conviction of moral mistake. Our duty in our depressed circumstances is to avoid such moral disturbance as we have not force to quell. We must, in submission and compassion to our own weakness, evade a decision if we honestly can, and if we cannot, we must accept of help, human help, and proceed upon the opinion of the soundest and most enlightened mind we can appeal to. If there are any who lift the eyebrows and shrug the shoulders at the supposition of this case, and declare that there is infallible direction to be found, in all particular cases, in the principles of religion, in answer to prayer, in the guidance of clergy, or the general opinion of mankind, I warn such that they will discover, sooner or later, that there is yet something for them to learn of morals, of the human mind, and of God's discipline of humanity. There is no point of which I am more sure than that it is unwise in sick people to keep a diary. Some suppose this task to be one of the duties of the sick room, whereas I am confident that it is one of the most dangerous of snares. The traveler, moving from scene to scene in high health and spirits, keeps a diary. He looks at it a few years after, and can scarcely believe his own eyes when he sees how many entries there are of his hunger, thirst, and sleepiness. He searches anxiously for a record of some fact, important to the determination of a truth in science, some fact of which he has a vague impression. He cannot find it, but finds in its stead that he was chilly on that morning, or went to bed hungry that night. If it be so in his case, how should the journal of a sick room avoid becoming a register of the changes of a morbid state? Not only this, but it can scarcely contain anything better. The experiencing and recording instruments themselves, the mind and body, are in a morbid condition and cannot be trusted to perceive and record faithfully. Moreover, our tendency is, at the best, to an intense and growing self-consciousness, and our efforts should, therefore, be directed to having our minds called out of themselves, to causing our days to pass away as little marked as possible. A diary of public events, a register of books read, or of the opinions of those whose opinions are valuable on the great questions of the time, may be more or less amusing and profitable to keep, but then the rule should be absolute to exclude all mention of ourselves, and my own belief is that it is wisest to avoid the temptation altogether, to keep clear of all bondage to ourselves and to habit that can be declined. I was unutterably moved lately by the reading of a diary preserved in MS of one of the most innocent, holy, and devoted of God's human children, a creature who entered upon life endowed with good gifts, spiritual, intellectual, and external, and who wasted away in body, dwindled away in mind, and sank early to the grave, clearly through the force given by superstition to a corroding self-consciousness, to which she was by constitution liable. Her diary yields clear lessons which might profitably be made known, but that they are not apparently recognized by those who had the charge of herself in life, and hold her papers now. Among these lessons, one is to our present purpose. Her diary became more and more a register of frames and feelings, each mood of which was fearfully important to herself as a token of God's dispositions towards her. To an eye which now reads the whole at once, side by side with the dates and incidents of her life, nothing can be clearer than that the risings and fallings of her spiritual state exactly corresponded with the condition of her health. In one portion, the record becomes almost too painful to be borne. While her days were passed in heavenly deeds and her solitude in prayer, she sinks daily lower and lower in hope and cheer, and at last, after a record of most mournful humiliation, we find a notice which explains all, of the breaking of a blood vessel. To us it is nothing strange to experience fluctuations of more than spirits, of heart and soul, and to ascertain after a time that they were owing to physical causes. We even anticipate these changes, and know that when we awake in the morning, we shall be harassed by such and such a thought, that at such an hour of the day we shall suffer under remorse for such and such an old act and word, or under fear of the consequences of conduct which, at other seasons, we know to be right. We have that to tell of ourselves, which seems as a key to the mournful diary I have mentioned. This experience and such warnings as that which has so deeply moved me should teach us the wisdom and duty of not cherishing by recording our personal cares, but rather of casting them upon Him who careth for us. The most fitting sick-room aspiration is to attain to a trusting carelessness as to what becomes of our poor dear selves, while we become more and more engrossed by the vast interests which our Father is conducting within our view, from the birdie which builds under our eaves to the gradual gathering of the nations towards the fold of Christ on the everlasting hills. End of Chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Life in the Sick Room, Essays by an Invalid. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life in the Sick Room, Essays by an Invalid by Harriet Martineau. Chapter 10, Some Gains and Sweets of Invalidism. God Almighty, there is a soul of goodness in things evil. Would man observingly distill it out? Shakespeare. Yet have they special pleasures, even mirth, by those undreamt of who have only trod life's valley smooth, and if the rolling earth to their nice ear have many a painful tone, they know man does not live by joy alone, but by the presence of the power of God. Milne. But here we are. That is a great fact, and if we tarry a little, we may come to learn that here is best. See to it only that thyself is here, and art and nature, hope and dread, friends, angels, and the Supreme Being shall not be absent from the chamber where thou sittest. Emerson. It is harder to be brief about our gains and privileges than about our peculiar troubles, but I must try to be so, for the discoveries we make, though to us all glowing with freshness and beauty, are, to those who merely receive them, as trite as any old moralities whatever. One great and strange blessing to us is the abolition of the future, of our own future in this life. It is commonly thought a chief privilege of childhood that it is passed without thought of the future, that the present is all in all. I doubt the truth of this. My own experience in childhood was of a painful and incessant longing for the future, a longing which enhanced all its innumerable pains and embittered many of its pleasures, a longing for strength of body and of mind, for independence of action, for an escape, in short, from the conditions of childhood. The privilege which I then missed I have found now. Let it be a comfort to all sorrowing friends of those who are under any sort of doom, without an assigned period to know, that in such cases the sense of doom vanishes. When the future becomes a blank to us, it becomes presently invisible. And when we sustain this change, we do not contract in our desires and interests, but, I humbly hope, the contrary. The thoughts which stretched forwards with eagerness and anxiety now spread themselves abroad more calmly and with more disinterestedness. There is danger of our losing sympathy with the young, the healthy, the ambitious, for we soon require to be reminded of those states of mind and those classes of interests which involve ambition or any kind of personal regard to the future. But if we can preserve these sympathies, it does appear to me that the change is, to ourselves, pure gain. The image of 5, 10, 20 years of our present life, or decline into deeper suffering ending in death, makes absolutely no impression upon us. We have not the slightest movement of a wish that it were otherwise. We do not turn our heads half round to see if there be no way of escape, and this is because our interests are all occupied with immediate and pressing objects, in which we have ascertained our true life to consist. Of these objects we would not surrender one for the permission to go back to the most brilliant point of our lives. Wealth would be a trouble to us, a responsibility we would rather decline, and it is astonishing to us that any man can wish for more than is needed to furnish his children well for the probation of life. Ambition and its objects, of course not including usefulness, appear to us so much voluntarily incurred bondage and fatigue. Subjection to the opinions of men, a dependence on their suffrages for any heartfelt object, seems a slavery so humbling and so unnecessary that we could hardly wonder sufficiently at it, but for the recollection that all human desires and passions are the instruments by which the work of the race is done, and that ambition is far from being among the lowest of these instruments. Those of us who had known formerly, for a sufficient length of time, what it was to have fame, did not need to be laid by to discover how soon and how thoroughly it becomes disregarded, except for its collateral privileges, and left behind among our forgotten objects of desire. But our present position is the best for following out its true history, for tracing that path a reach beyond the point where moralists commonly leave it. The young aspirant is warned betimes, without practical effect, that the privileges of obscurity are irrecoverable, that when he has become famous, he may long in vain for the quiet shelter of privacy that he has left. He feels this with a sense of panic when he has gained the celebrity he longs for, and is undergoing his first agonies from adverse opinion. If he would but believe us, we watchers could tell him that, though he can never retreat into his original privacy, there is yet more complete shelter before him, if he does not linger or take up his rest short of his journey's end. This shelter is not to be found in indifference, in contempt for human opinion, that ugly mask behind which some strive to hide the workings of an agonized countenance, while the scorchings of scorn beat fiercely on their brains, and the jeerings of ridicule torture their ears. There is no rest, no shelter in contempt, and human opinion can never be naturally despised, though it has no claim to any man's allegiance. The true and welcome ultimate shelter of the celebrated is in great interests, great objects. If they use the power their fame puts into their hands for the furtherance of any of the great ends for which Providence is operating, they find themselves by degrees in possession once more of the external freedom, the internal quiet, the genuine privacy of soul, which they believed forfeited forever, while the consciousness of the gaze of the world was upon them. They read what is said of themselves in print, just as if it was said of any other person, if it be laudatory, and with a quieter feeling still if it be adverse, as I shall presently describe. It is sometimes said that it is a pity when great men do not happen to die on the completion of the one grand achievement of their lives, instead of taming down the effect by living on afterwards like common men. That Clarkson should have died on the abolition of the slave trade, Howard after his first or second journey, Scott on the publication of his best romance, and so on. But there is a melodramatic air about such a wish, which appears childish to moral speculators. We are glad to have Clarkson still, to honor freshly in his old age. We see more glory about the head of John Quincy Adams contending as a representative in Congress for popular rights than he ever wore as President of the United States. We should be glad that Rowland Hill should live and work as a common man for a quarter of a century after the complete realization of his magnificent boon to society. In truth, we behold great men entering early upon their heaven, when we see them tranquilly retired, or engaged in common labours after their most memorable task is accomplished. The worthiest of celebrated men would, I believe, be found if their meditations could be read, anticipating with the highest satisfaction, as the happiest part of their prospect beyond the grave, their finding a level condition once more, being encompassed by equals, or, as the popular preacher puts it, starting fair from the new post. Such being the natural desire of simple hearts, there is a pleasure to spectators in seeing them, while still here encompassed with fellowship, not set above nor apart, though enjoying the natural recompenses of their deeds. The words natural recompenses remind me of another gain conferred on us by our condition, scarcely separable perhaps from those I have mentioned, from the extinction of all concern about our future in this world and the ordinary objects of pursuit, but yet to us so conspicuous, so heartfelt, as to demand record as a blessing by itself. I mean the conviction of the hollowness of all talk of reward for conduct, the conviction of the essential blessedness of goodness. What can appear more trite? Where is the church or chapel in which it is not preached every Sunday? Yet we, who heard and believed through all the Sundays and weekdays of many years, seem but now to have known this truth. Our knowledge is now tested by the indifference with which we behold men struggling for other objects, under a sort of insanity, as it appears to us, while the interests which animate us to sympathy are those of the pure in heart, seeing God before they die. and the dread which chills our souls is for the multitude who live in passion and die in moral insensibility. To us it appears so obviously the supreme good to have a healthy soul, serenely reposing in innocence and spontaneously working for God and man, that all divergence of aims from this end seems madness, and all imagery of rewards for moral desert the most profane of mockeries. It is a matter of wonder to us that we ever conceived of royalty otherwise than as a title to compassion, of hereditary honours as desirable, of fame as an end, and we are apt to wonder at others, in their turn, that they do not perceive the most blessed of our race to be the moral reformers of each age, passing from strength to strength, although wearing out in their enterprise, and the placid well-doers, whether high or lowly in their service. The appendages themselves of such a state, the esteem, honour, and love which wait upon moral desert, almost vanish from our notice when we are contemplating the infinite blessedness of the peace of a holy heart. Then we have, not to dwell on a matter already spoken of, a peculiar privilege in the peculiar loveliness which the image of death assumes to us. In our long leisure, all sweet and soothing associations of rest, of relief from anxiety and wearing thought, of re-entrance upon society, a society how sanctified, of the realization of our best conceptions of what is holy, noble, and perfect, all affections, all aspirations gather round the idea of death, till it recurs at all our best moments, and becomes an abiding thought of peace and joy. When we hear or read of the departure of any one we knew, of the death even of the youngest or the most active, a throb of congratulatory feeling is our first emotion, rather than the shock which we used to experience, and which we now see sustained by those around us. Reflection or tidings of survivors may change our view, but so does the image of death become naturally endeared to us, that our first spontaneous thought is of favour to those who are selected for it. I am not recommending this impression as rational, but intimating it as characteristic of a peculiar condition. It is no slight privilege, however, to have that great idea which necessarily confronts every one of us, all clothed with loveliness instead of horror or mere mystery. Till now we never knew how any anticipation may be incessantly filling with sweetness. It may be doubted whether there is a more heartfelt peace experienced at any point of our moral progress than in the right reception of calumnious injury. In the immediate return from the first recoil into the mood of forgiveness, there is something heavenly even to the novice. In the compassion for one's calumniator there is pain, and it is a pain which increases with experience of life, and with our insight into the peril and misery of an unjust and malicious habit of mind. But in the act of pitying forgiveness there is a solace so sweet as to make one wonder how long men will be in adopting this remedy for their injuries. Any one who has been ambitious, and with success, will, if he be wise, be ready to declare that not the first breath of fame was to him so sweet as the first emotions of forgiveness, the first stirrings of the love of enemies, after his earliest experience of the calumny by which all public effort is sure to be assailed. I am not supposing cowardly acquiescence in insult and injury. I am supposing the due self-assertion made, or defence found not to be practicable. This is all that others have to do with. A man's self-communion on the matter is his own private affair, and little know the systematic calumniators who, for party's or prejudice's sake, assail those who can only return silence, how they really work in some hearts they seek to wound. In some they may excite rage or bitter anguish, but there are others, probably many, in which they cause no severer pain than a pitying sorrow for themselves, while they kindle a glow of courage, patience, and benignity. They cause a more exquisite mingling of sweet emotions than were ever aroused by praise. The more defenceless the injured, the more private and the more heavenly are these passages of his soul, and none are more defenceless than sick prisoners. If subject to such injuries in the world, where they could by their presence perpetually live down false aspersions on their opinions as well as on their conduct, helpless indeed are they when living out of sight, dumb in regard to society and through the press. Then if their party foes take the opportunity to assail and misrepresent their opinions and their acts, those foes can have all their own way abroad in the world. But the very air of our sick-room turns them from foes into best friends. After one moment's sickening at the poor malice and cowardice, our thoughts fix on the high and holy truths to which they direct us, on the transience of error, the nothingness of fame, in the serious passages of life, the powerlessness of assaults from without, while we possess ourselves, till we end in a calm and sweet mood of contentedness for ourselves, and affectionate intercession for the victims of angry passion or of sordid interests. It does not move us painfully to think of our helplessness, to contemplate leaving life without explaining our opinions or justifying our views and enterprises. What is just and true will abide and prevail. And as for our claims to a share in the reputation, they seem in the sick-room worthy of only a smile. If we wrought for reputation, we must suffer, sooner or later, for the lowness of the aim. And now may be our time for taking a new growth through pain. But if we wrought for truth and good, we are not susceptible of the venom of the party slanderer. His sting proves no sting, but a beneficial touch, rousing in us many tender and resolute and benignant feelings. These may be awakened wherever such a touch reaches us, but nowhere perhaps so sensibly as in the privacy and lowliness of the sick-room. I need say nothing of the benefit brought to us by the same act in the sympathy of generous minds. Of the blessing of sympathy I have already said so much that I dare scarcely approach the subject again. And never, as all know, does ministering affection so abound as towards the injured. When injury and helplessness unite their claims, there is no end to the multitude of hearts that throng to defend and aid. They are far more than are needed, for few, extremely few, are those who venture or who like to send the enmity of public life into the retreats of privacy. Very rare, I believe, is the species of men who insult when all the world knows there can be no reply. Still such cases are witnessed, and of their operation I have spoken. The greater number of invalids are under no such liability, but all may be subject to some injustice, some misrepresentation which may reach their knowledge, and their emotions, both of recoil and of renovation, may be like in kind, and even equal in degree to those I have intimated. If occasions for forgiveness should arise, and to whom do they not, may its relish be as sweet to them as it assuredly is to some more extensively tried. An inestimable gain from the longest sickness is the outgrowth of the scruples and other conflicts which constitute the chief evil of merely long sickness. Of some perils and pains of our condition I have spoken, and I must therefore declare that there is a remedial influence in the very infirmity which appears to create them. If it be but continued long enough, if the struggle be not broken off before it is fairly exhausted, victory will declare itself on the side of peace. We may be long in passing through the experience of weakness, humiliation, and submission, but up through acquiescence we must rise, sooner or later, true things separating themselves infallibly from the transient, and all that is important revealing itself in its due proportions, till our vision is cleared and our hearts are at rest. If the invalid of 5 years can smile at some of the anxieties and scrupulosities of his first season of retreat, much more clear-sighted must the 10-years thinker be in regard to the snares and troubles of his early or midway term. If amidst the gain as little as possible be lost, the privileges of our state may be such, not as indeed to compare with those of health and a natural mode of life, but as may satisfy a humble and rational hope that our season of probation is not lost, nor materially wasted. The sick room is a sanctuary of confidence. It is a natural confessional, where the spontaneous revelations are perhaps as ample as any enforced disclosures from disciple to priest, and without any of the mischiefs of enforcement. We may be excluded from much observation of the outer life of men, but of the inner life which originates and interprets the outer, it is scarcely possible that in any other circumstances we could have known so much. Into what depths of opinion are we not let down? To what soaring heights of speculation are we not borne up? What is there of joy or sorrow, of mystery and marvel in human experience that is not communicated to us? And all this not as if read in print, not half revealed in the form of hints to such as can understand, not in general terms as addressed to the general, but spoken fully and freely, with that particularity which fastens words upon the soul for ever, with those living tones of emotion which make the hearer a partner in all that is and has been felt. Here we learn that the whole experience of humanity may be contained in one bosom, through such participation as we ourselves entertain, and even that all opinions, the most various and the most incompatible, may be deposited in one intellect for gradual review without inducing skepticism, and possibly to the strengthening of the powers and privileges of faith. Goethe, the seer of humanity, formed in himself the habit of agreeing with all the opinions uttered to him, alleging as his ground that there is always a sense in which everything is true, and that it is a good to encourage and an evil to discourage any belief arrived at in natural course. There are men with minds of a far lower order, but still somewhat superior to the average, who do precisely the reverse. They see far enough to be aware that there is always something to be said to the contrary of what they hear uttered, and they cannot help saying it. They fall into a habit of invariable opposition, justifying the practice to themselves by the plea of impartiality, of resistance to dogmatism, of love of truth, and the like. I disapprove of both habits. Both practically injure belief, and damage the interests of truth. The natural operation of Goethe's method was to encourage in many indolence in the pursuit of truth, and carelessness about opinions; in some, doubts of the very existence of truth; and in all reflective persons, a keen sense of the insult conveyed, however unintentionally, by such treatment. Far worse, however, is the influence of the antagonist order of minds, not only from their comparative numbers, for there is not a Goethe in 500 years, but from the direct operation of their method and their example. A man who forms a habit of intellectual antagonism destroys more than can ever be repaired, both in his own mind and in those which he influences. He allows no rest in any supposition, even to those who have not power or leisure to follow out the research. He cuts their own ground from under them, and does not establish them on any other, for he himself appears to be established on none. Men of this order are, above all others, fickle in their opinions. complacently supposing themselves impartial investigators into truth, they are in fact the sport of any one who, discerning and playing with their weakness, can put them up to the assertion and defence of any opinions whatever, and lead them into daily self-contradiction. What ensues is seen at a glance. They tamper with truth till the structure of their own intellect becomes fatally impaired. They denounce as bigots all men of every order of mind who remain steady in any opinions, and especially such as continue to hold opinions which they have themselves quitted. They never doubt of their own fluctuations being progression, and that they are leaving all stable believers behind. They learn no caution in the publication of their so-called opinions from their own incessant changes, but rather pique themselves on their eagerness to exhibit and insist upon each new view, and enjoy the occasion it affords for complacent amazement at all who hold the positions which they have themselves abandoned. It may be said that such men lose their influence, and with it their power for mischief. It is true that by degrees more and more decline argument with them, and they cease to have any convincing power, because it is seen that they themselves do not rest in permanent convictions. But their disturbing power remains. They can destroy, though they cannot build up. They can unsettle minds which yet they cannot lead. They can distress and perplex the humble and narrowly informed. They can startle not only the slothful, who will turn to sleep again on the plea of the foible of the awakener, but the nervous and feeble who need repose. And worse than all, they can irreparably injure the young by spreading before them wide fields of inquiry, and then hunting them out of every corner in which they would be disposed to stay and rest and think. Men of this kind of mind have a certain power of sympathy with every species of opinion, and this good and attractive quality it is which mainly causes their self-deception, and aggravates their power of injury. They mistake it for candour at the very moment that they overflow with intolerance towards holders of opinions which they have relinquished. The result in such cases is always the same: intellectual ruin throughout the department of the understanding, however eminent the dialectical powers may appear, through the constant practice which has increased their original strength. And with the intellectual damage must be combined great moral injury. Goethe's method appears to be dangerous, but the opposite one is fatal. To us, the depositories of vast confidences on these matters, it appears that there is no manner of necessity for either practice. We can avouch, from what we witness, that there may be sympathy with every order of understanding and every phase of opinion, without either hypocrisy, or a tendency to disputation, or a surrender of differing views. We see how there may be an intrepid and continuous avowal of opinions, without disturbance to the unlearned and the feeble. We can fully agree with Goethe as to the unequalled mischief of endangering belief in that vast majority of minds which have other work to do than to investigate matters of opinion, without seeing it to be at all necessary to countenance what we know or believe to be error. We can fully agree with his practical antagonists as to the nobleness of candour and the evils which ensue from dogmatism, while at the same time we would sooner die than dare to tempt one intellect to follow us after one's self-conviction of such an instability as theirs. Where there is a habit of mutability, there is intellectual infirmity, as is shown with indescribable clearness to us gazers into the mirror of events. It is a singular privilege granted to us to witness the workings of the best method, and of that simplicity and godly sincerity which is unconsciously adopted by the wise, to whom truth is neither the spirit of rashness nor of fear, but of power and of love, and of a sound mind. It has occurred to me at times that a second volume on the formation and publication of opinions, less popularly useful perhaps than the existing one, but deeper and more comprehensive, might be an invaluable gift from the hands of some one in a retreat, in a sick retreat, as illness invites confidence, from the hands of some one who would know how to use with equal discretion and intrepidity his singular opportunities. One of our most valuable discoveries is often made elsewhere, but is not sufficiently acknowledged and acted upon. We find, after a trial of many methods, that we learn to endure and achieve less by direct effort than by putting ourselves under influences favorable to the state of mind we seek. We have discovered the same thing before in regard to mending our faults. We have found that childhood and youth were the seasons of resolution, and that perhaps we have not since cured ourselves of a single fault by direct effort. I am persuaded that instances are extremely rare of rectification by such means. I have myself amended only one bad habit, and that a very trifling one, by express effort since I was 20. And I could point out only 2 or 3 of all my acquaintance that I know to be capable of self-improvement in that direct manner, and I cannot but honour them in proportion to my sense of the difficulty and rarity of this exercise of moral power. Yet how people go on expecting reformation in sinners from a mere conviction of the reason actuating the will, as they suppose, infallibly, the consequence of which foolish expectation is, that the true appliances are neglected. Wordsworth has it, "Resolve," the haughty moralist would say, "this single act is all that we demand. Alas, such wisdom bids a creature fly, whose very sorrow is that time hath shorn his natural wings." Instead of losing time and practically invoking despair by exhorting to impossible flights, wise guardians will rather remove the sufferer into an element of new enterprise, or one which may gradually exhaust and destroy his parasitical foes of habit. We sufferers experimentally ascertain this very soon. We find how little reason we have to trust to efforts of resolution under circumstances which tend to enfeeble resolution. We might be capable, as so many others are, of any amount of effort on a single emergency, but when we have to deal with a permanent infliction, to make the best of a difficult mode of life, we find that we must put our trust in abiding influences, and not in a succession of efforts. We therefore lay aside defiance. We submit ourselves, not to our troubles, but to every kind of natural preventive remedy and solace. We arrange our personal habits so as to husband our ease and to conceal our pain, and we place our minds under such influences, intellectual and spiritual, as may best nourish our higher powers and occupy our energies to the alleviation, if it may not be to the exclusion, of the suffering, whose challenge we will neither entertain nor defy. Among other merits of this method may be reckoned this, that it helps to introduce us to a privilege which may be disregarded by many, but which to us is inestimable, that of causing pleasure rather than pain to those connected with us. It is the prerogative of the healthy and happy to give pleasure wherever they go. It is the worst humiliation and grievance of the suffering that they cause suffering. To the far-seeing invalid, who is aware not only of this immediate effect, but of its remote consequences, this is the most afflicting feature of his condition. If we can, by any management, evade this liability, we have cause to be grateful indeed. If by submitting ourselves to all softening and ennobling influences we can so nourish and educe the immortal part of ourselves as to subdue our own conflicts, and present our active and enjoying aspect to those who visit us, we are absolved from the worst penalties of our state. If, as years pass on, we find ourselves sought from the impulse of inclination, as well as from the stringency of duty, if we are permitted to see faces light up from ours, and hear the music of mirth succeed to the low, serious tones of sympathetic greeting, we may let our hearts bound with the assurance that all is well with us. When we cannot refuse to see that children come to us eagerly, and that our riper companions stay late by our sofa, and come again and again, till nothing short of duty calls them away, any one might envy us the feeling with which we lie down again in our solitude. We are not proud, like the young beauty with her conquest over hearts, or like the political or literary hero with his sway over the passions or the reason, but we are elate, and not without cause elate, in our privilege of annihilating the constraint and distaste inspired by our condition, and of finding ourselves restored to something like an equality of intercourse with the healthy in soul. The best and highest must ever be selected from among the healthy and the happy, from among those whose conditions of being are the most perfectly fulfilled, but without aspiring to their consummate privileges, we feel ourselves abundantly blessed in such a partial emancipation as permits us on occasion and without shame to join their glorious company. The end. End of chapter 10. End of Life in the Sick Room, Essays by an Invalid, by Harriet Martineau.